Der Fliegende Holländer, The Flying Dutchman, by Richard Wagner. No person has attracted more controversy than Richard Wagner. It has been claimed that more books have been written about him than any other figure in history, with the single exception of Christ. Opinions of his life and work range from condemnation as a mentor of the Third Reich up to the critic Ernest Newman's claim that he was the greatest genius the world had ever known. Why all the fuss? The answer lies partly in the fact that he was the dominating figure of 19th century culture, not just music, and the reforms he brought about in theatre, music and opera would dominate and influence Western culture for over 100 years. That can be said of no other musician or artist. Add in rampant anti-Semitism, political opportunism of the worst sort, sexual misadventuring and monstrous ingratitude to those who helped him, and you have an intoxicating brew. He was to music what Karl Marx was to politics or Picasso was to painting. A revolutionary who not only changed the face of his chosen sphere forever, but attracted worldwide adulation and loathing while he did so. He has a claim to being the greatest opera composer of all time, especially if you take the word opera literally. It is a Latin plural, the plural of opus, a work, and therefore means literally the works. This reflects its function as a combination of all the other arts, poetry, music, drama, design, and a whole range of technical skills. By creating his Gesamtkunstwerk, total work, where the creative artist, Wagner himself, of course, wrote the poem, composed the music, directed the staging, and conducted the performance, he redefined opera for all time. It follows that of all the operatic peaks, none is as daunting as Richard Wagner. The towering masterworks like Tristan und Isolde, The Ring of the Nibelung, and the Master Singers of Nuremberg appear to most people almost unapproachable. So, it is good to know that his mighty output can be approached through at least one opera, The Flying Dutchman, which contains all the elements of Wagner's mature genius, but on a human scale. The Flying Dutchman, in other words, is the ideal introduction to Wagner's works, as well as being a hugely enjoyable piece in its own right. A short history of Wagner's astonishing career would read something like this. He was born in 1813, coincidentally the same year as the great Italian master, Verdi. And like most artists, his first few works were less than triumphant. Die Feen, Das Liebesverbot, based on Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost, and Rienzi have largely disappeared from the world's stages. But, starting with The Flying Dutchman, Der Fliegende Holländer, in 1843, his career, at least artistically, was one of blazing triumph. I say artistically because in every other way, financially, politically, and emotionally, he virtually defined Sturm und Drang. This movement had begun in German literature in the 18th century and carried to extremes the struggles of an individual against society or the elements. Shakespeare was their idol. The best writers such as Goethe and Schiller developed it, but it also led to melodrama, so popular in the 19th century. Wagner immortalized a particular type of German romanticism in such lovely works as Tannhäuser and Lohengrin, wrote the most blatantly erotic work of all in Tristan und Isolde, incarnated the German spirit in Die Meistersinger von Nuremberg, and created one of civilization's greatest achievements in Der Ring des Nibelungen, his 14-and-a-half-hour retelling of the old Germanic creation myths. You may not choose to have Michelangelo's Creation of Adam on your sitting-room ceiling, or Beethoven's late quartets on your car stereo, but you have to admit them as among the greatest works of the human spirit. Similarly, The Ring is a towering masterpiece, and one that repays a lifetime of study. The Flying Dutchman is not in that Olympian league, thank goodness, but it does contain many of the hallmarks, many of the footprints of the later, greater works. Before we leave the idea of Wagner's life-work, it is worth reminding ourselves of just how much we owe to Richard Wagner in terms of melodic splendour and an opulence of style which was to prove so influential. Many of the effects we take for granted in film scores, for example, the use of themes, of tension-building orchestral climaxes, either began or came to fruition with Wagner. A more learned introduction to his work than this one might take the view that in Tristan he took tonality to its outer limits, wrote the last word, or note if you like, on music, and paved the way for the atonality of the 20th century. Music since Wagner has changed, but has not necessarily advanced beyond the limits he set. His next great hit, after The Flying Dutchman, was Tannhäuser, whose prelude contains one of those profoundly spiritual and extended melodies which were to be a hallmark of the composer. The story of the conflict between spirituality and lust is also a Wagner hallmark, of his operas, that is. In life, there was never any doubt which came first, and that was not spirituality. It is always one of life's major mysteries how music of this spiritual power could have been written by a man who possessed no moral scruples of his own. Tannhäuser dates from 1845, and next came Lohengrin, a deeply emotional and moving retelling of one of the great chivalric myths in which German romanticism abounds. Three other great stand-alone works bracket his later, greater career. No other opera, maybe no other work of art, portrays so terribly the nature of sexual longing as Tristan und Isolde. And if such a profoundly philosophical work can be described in a few words, then Tristan is about the love so intense that it cannot find fulfillment in this life. Only in the love-death, Liebestod, can it be resolved. That longing is expressed in the aching opening bars of the prelude. That aching longing finds resolution, finds fulfillment only in death. Musically, the chords are resolved, the harmony is completed, and we find peace at the very end. Tristan und Isolde dates from 1865, Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg from 3 years later. It is altogether a warmer, more autumnal work, which manages to combine something of that brassy splendour we so much enjoyed in Lohengrin with a deeper, more philosophical view of life, incarnated in the poet-cobbler Hans Sachs. Here is the opening of its prelude, to remind one of that quality of majesty which is a vital element of Wagner's work. His final work was Parsifal, perhaps the most controversial opera ever written. Regarded by some as a deeply spiritual work of profound Christian sensibility, and by others as the cant and humbug of one of history's most truly immoral artists. It is also one of the slowest-moving works ever written, and its leisurely span has driven some listeners nuts and others into nirvana. Again, the opening of the prelude tells us a lot, and it seems to me to be as devastating a statement of spiritual longing as Tristan is of sexual longing. And then there's the Ring. Starting at the bottom of the Rhine, in the key of E-flat, it builds over about 14 hours and 40 minutes, over 4 nights, into a massive pageant of the downfall of an old order, the creation of a master race, its betrayal and ultimate redemption through the selfless love of a woman. An idea, incidentally, which we shall meet for the first time in The Flying Dutchman. There is time only to remind ourselves of the more majestic moments in the Ring, for example, the entrance of the gods into Valhalla at the end of Das Rheingold. The famous, or is that notorious, Ride of the Valkyries. and the terrifying solemnities of Siegfried's funeral march from Götterdämmerung, indispensable as background music to any documentary on the last years of the Third Reich. Wagner was, after all, Hitler's favourite composer. Listen as the servants strenuously lift aloft the bier of the dead Siegfried, as the orchestra crashes out the doom-laden chords for the dead hero, and as the orchestra goes on to review the life of Siegfried with a stunning parade of the themes or leitmotifs associated with his life. We have time for only an extract. That last blazing trumpet tune you heard was the motif of Siegfried himself. The tune, like the hero, finding its glorious apotheosis in death. Let's look now at some of the ways in which The Flying Dutchman, though an early work and written when the composer was in his 20s, contains many of the elements of his later and more revolutionary work. Wagner's best-known contribution to music was the development, not the invention, others had done it before, of the leitmotif, the leading motif, or, to undignify it slightly, signature tune. Basically, all this means is a musical theme which represents a person, an emotion, a building, anything really, and which recurs whenever that person or thing is evoked in the drama. What Wagner did that was so extraordinary was to take his signature tunes, hereinafter called leitmotifs, and develop them in such a way that the various threads of melody become the fabric of the drama. We'll demonstrate that as we go along. And when he came to write The Ring, his mightiest creation, we see that it owes its amazing wholeness and integrity to the fact that it is a huge symphonic development over 4 days of as many as 120 leitmotifs and themes. The Flying Dutchman has far fewer, and for the moment we are only going to worry about 4 major ones. 2 other elements of Wagner's great career, pre-echoed in Dutchman, we have referred to already: his love of the old Norse and Germanic myths, and his belief that man is essentially flawed and can only be redeemed through the self-sacrificing love of a selfless woman. He was to live by that code, and expect his womenfolk to abide by it, but that is another and very sordid tale for another time. The great thing about the overture to The Flying Dutchman, in addition to being a wonderful concert piece in its own right, is that it introduces us to and familiarises us with the major themes which will dominate the opera. As early as 1864, the conductor, Franz Wagner, famously remarked on "the wind that blows out at you wherever you open the score." And no wonder. In the opening seconds of the overture, we meet the most important leitmotif, that of the Dutchman himself. Listen for 2 seconds of high string tremolo, and then immediately a glorious and mysterious-sounding theme on the French horns, representing the Dutchman of the title. Next, listen for a wildly scurrying, rising and falling theme under the Dutchman's theme that represents the sea, the elements. Now a ravishing descending theme on the woodwinds, which represents Zenta, the heroine, but more philosophically represents redemption, and more specifically, redemption brought about through love. And one last tune. This hearty, bucolic theme represents the Norwegian sailors. The entire 11 minutes of the overture is a kind of miniature symphony or tone poem on these various themes. To know the overture is to know a great deal of the music of The Flying Dutchman. The plot of the opera is amazingly simple, for Wagner, anecdotal almost. The title character, a legendary figure whose story is as old as seafaring, is a Dutch captain who made a pact with the devil that he would round the Cape of Good Hope even if it took him all eternity. The devil took him at his word, as a result of which he is condemned to sail the 7 seas forever. His only hope of reprieve is that he is allowed to come ashore every 7 years, and if he is able to find a woman to love him faithfully unto death, he can find rest. He finds such a woman in Zenta, but mistakenly thinks she is being unfaithful with another sailor, Eric, and furiously sails away. Zenta sacrifices herself by throwing herself off a cliff, and the opera ends with Dutchman and Zenta finding salvation together. Right from the first bars of the overture, we are aware of being in the presence not so much of a gifted young composer as of a force of nature. Wagner was perhaps the greatest egotist the world has ever known, and all of his operas, they say, are more or less autobiographical. When he wrote The Flying Dutchman, he was in Paris, an exile, impoverished, a wanderer on the face of the earth. He had just suffered a horrifying sea crossing from Riga to London, en route to Paris, and the ship had been blown off course and found shelter in a Norwegian fjord. Wagner had been impressed by the effect of the sailors' voices rebounding and echoing off the walls of the fjord, and of course used the effect, along with his horrifying memories of the storm, in his opera. Darland, the Norwegian captain, ascertains that they are within sight of home, that the ship is safe, and goes below to rest and wait for favourable wind, leaving the young steersman on watch. He has a lovely scene to himself, which starts with his fighting off sleep and dreaming of his girlfriend who awaits him.
Mit Gewitter und Sturm aus fernem Meer, ein Mädel bin dir nah. Über turmhohe Flut vom Süden her, mein Mädel, ich bin da.
And as he drifts in that half-awake, half-asleep state, we hear in the orchestra a theme we recognise as a spectral version of the Dutchman motif, signalling the arrival alongside the Norwegian ship of the phantom vessel. Next, we have the first of those extraordinary and often very long narratives when the principal bass baritone soliloquizes. Be it the Dutchman, Wotan in The Ring, Hans Sachs in Die Meistersinger, it is really Wagner in disguise. The recitative, that is a kind of accompanied monologue, opens with the marvellously chilling words, Die Frist ist the time has come. 7 years have passed, and the Dutchman is allowed ashore to seek rest. Here is that hollow, soulless opening phrase.
Die Frist ist
He sings of his curse and the torments of the ocean, and as he does so, listen for the furious repetitions of that sea or elements motif we met in the overture. The Dutchman's literal foe may be the devil, but Satan manifests himself in the fury of the elements, every sailor's real nemesis. The middle section of the aria is altogether more thoughtful, as he muses on his chance of finding peace. But he ends in rage and despair. Only when the dead arise at the final day will I find rest. And the orchestra signals the last trump as he vents his rage and despair in a stunning conclusion to a very great aria.
stehen, an Erde ist in nichts vergehen. In nichts
You'll notice the majestic statement of the Dutchman's theme at the end of that aria. Scene, really. And when you contrast it with the spectral version of the theme in the steersman's song, you understand what a wonderful device the leitmotif is in Wagner's hands. There is a long scene between Daland and the Dutchman, which begins with the old Norwegian offering hospitality to the stranger, and moves into a sordid pact. Daland is dazzled by a display of riches from the Dutchman, tells him that he, Daland, has a lovely daughter, and pledges Zenta in exchange for a share of the loot. When the Dutchman hears this, he and Daland have a duet, which is another magic melodic moment, and introduces, improbably but effectively, a waltz rhythm. This incident concludes when the steersman announces a south wind, which will take them home. And the sailors make ready as Daland welcomes the Dutchman to his home in an infectiously joyful tune. And the act ends with some wonderfully hearty singing from the homeward-bound Norwegian sailors. Wagner originally conceived The Flying Dutchman as a continuous one-act piece with no intermissions, but the technical limitations of his day made it necessary to put in intermissions. That, and the fact that some people would think 2 hours and 18 minutes too long to sit without wandering off to talk to friends or visiting the bar. But in fact, the first acts of some of Wagner's later operas, Götterdämmerung and Parsifal come to mind, are as long or longer than the whole of The Flying Dutchman, and Das Rheingold is in one uninterrupted act of 2 hours and 25 minutes, or more, depending on who's conducting. Major Hollywood movies now often run to nearly 3 hours. That and advances in theatre technology mean there is no longer any need for the intermissions, and this recording, where fortunately all the scene changes take place in the mind's eye, correctly goes straight on into the second act. So, after the sailors have sung their hearty song and got ready to sail off, you will hear the orchestra neatly segue into the accompaniment to the spinning chorus, at which point we'll pause again. the scene has changed to the inside of Dahlon's house, where Zenta, our heroine, Marta, Zenta's nurse, though she seems a bit old to have a nurse, governess maybe, and all the assembled village maidens are awaiting the return of the sailors. Most are spinning. All, in fact, except Zenta, who is staring compulsively at a portrait on the wall, which looks suspiciously like the mysterious mariner, the Dutchman, we, but not she, met in the first act. Let us hear the marvellously atmospheric spinning chorus, and you will not need to be prompted to listen to the extraordinary skill with which Wagner depicts the humming of the spinning wheels. There is some good-natured teasing of Zenta, who does not join in with the girl's merriment, but continues to stare fixedly at the portrait, clearly obsessed with it. At the girl's prompting, she launches into her great aria, which is called a ballade, and is a retelling of the Dutchman legend. It starts with a recap of that music we heard at the very top of the overture, combining the themes of the elements, wind and sea, and the Dutchman. Then she sings an odd phrase, yo-ho-ho, yo-ho-ho, which pre-echoes the ho-yo-to-ho calls of a later Wagner heroine, Brunhilde, in The Ring. The important point about these calls, fascinating as they are in themselves, is that they are a vocal statement of the Dutchman's theme. The first part of the aria is dominated by a strong descending theme like this. But as she gets carried away by the tale of the doomed mariner, other themes with which we are now familiar appear, and the ballade uses them to great effect. Here, a recap of the storm motif as she sings of his struggles against the elements, calmed by the redemption motif. A short demonstration of the leitmotif in action. And when the chorus of village maidens rhetorically ask where such a redeeming angel might exist, they have an exquisite choral setting of the redemption theme. But of course Zenta would be no daughter of Richard Wagner, or precursor of Brunhilde, if she didn't have her rowdier moments, and in response to the girl's question, she sings how that mission is hers, and brings the aria to a rousing conclusion. The tenor you heard at the end there was Eric, who is Zenta's hometown boyfriend, and one of the saner elements in the drama. He loves Zenta and believes, correctly as it turns out, that she is fatally fixated on the Dutchman's legend. He has come to tell Zenta that her father has returned, and takes the opportunity to remind her that her father is due to choose a husband for her. He sees himself in this role, but is a poor country boy with few possessions, while Zenta's father, Darland, as we have discovered, has a highly developed acquisitive streak. Who will plead my case, Eric wistfully asks, in the first of his two deeply felt arias.
Mein Herz wollt rein ist zu sterben, mein Herz dich tut, mein jener Blick, darf so deine Hand dich bergen, stößt dich dein Vater nicht zurück. Wenn dann mein Herz im Jammer bricht, sagt Zenta, wenn man für mich spricht. Wenn dann mein Herz im Jammer bricht, wenn dann mein Herz im Jammer bricht, sagt Zenta, wer dann für mich spricht.
There is a long scene between the two of them when Eric tries in vain to talk Zenta out of her obsession and of her goal of being the redeeming angel to the Dutchman. At the end of the scene, Darland enters, accompanied by the tall, dark stranger, and there is a great deal of silent, meaningful staring, which will become a Wagner speciality in later operas. Darland chides his daughter for ignoring him and launches into another of those marvellous melodies in which this youthful opera abounds, as he introduces the mysterious mariner to Zenta, singing his praises. But notice how the melodic joys are introduced in the orchestra, and the voice is almost, but not quite, secondary.
Heimat steht so
But handsome vocal amends are made to Darland at the end of his aria when he prepares to leave Zenta alone with the stranger, having frankly pointed out the wealth of this mysterious suitor and expressed the hope that she will consent to marry him. Such super salesmanship is, of course, superfluous, as Dutchman and Zenta are fixated, as we would say nowadays, on each other. Often amid my torments, sings the stranger, I would see in my imagination a face and form like this. He also asks if she will follow her father's wishes and marry him, and in an exquisite passage she says that whoever he is, and wherever fate will lead them, she will be his. Again, listen for the exciting horn writing in the orchestra at her response. His hailing of Zenta as his redeeming angel builds into the closest we shall find to a love duet in this opera. Darland returns, and the act ends with all three principals in a high state of rejoicing. Zenta has found her destiny, the Dutchman his salvation, and Darland his retirement fund. Again, on a recording, we are able to move seamlessly from Daland's hut to the short final act of the opera set in a sheltered cove, with both the Norwegian, that's Daland's ship, and the Dutchman's moored together. There is a startling contrast between the light and gaiety of the Norwegian ship, alive with sailors getting roaring drunk in the finest Scandinavian tradition, and the spectral, death-like stillness of the Dutchman's ship. Let's pick up where we left off. Hear the wonderful orchestral interlude that links the acts, combining a number of the themes with which we are now familiar, and segue into the hearty clumping dance of the Norwegian sailors. All opera produced in Paris in the 19th century had to have a ballet in Act 3, though whether the gentlemen of the Jockey Club, the ballet's greatest supporters, and usually for non-balletic reasons, quite had in mind a ballet of Norwegian sailors in welly boots is unlikely. As this extended chorus scene progresses, the girls urge the sailors to try to summon up some extra guests from the neighbouring Dutch ship. The reception they get is distinctly and, quite literally, frosty. Listen as the ghostly voices sing from the Dutchman's ship as they prepare to weigh anchor for another 7 years, convinced that their master will have failed in his quest for the perfect and redeeming woman. What superb orchestral writing! We move now to the denouement of the opera, and the agent of that is Eric. His dream has foretold that Zenta would join the Dutchman, and he attempts to bar her way and prevent her from self-destruction. He sings again of his love for her in this very touching piece called a cavatina, recalling their former happy days together, with, as we'll see, disastrous results. Inevitably, the Dutchman chooses this moment to stroll by, and he witnesses the scene. Given his poor track record with redeeming angels, he assumes that Zenta is being unfaithful. He roundly curses almost everybody, except Zenta, whom he exempts from the plenary damnation usually visited upon fallen angels, and before heading back to the ship, loudly announces his true identity: Der Fliegende Holländer, the Flying Dutchman. To get the full impact of the dramatic ending, and the way the orchestra, by restating the leitmotifs, is able to function as the true dramatist of the piece, you need to hear the ending uninterrupted. Here's what happens. The Dutchman sets sail. Zenta rushes up onto the headland and calls out to him that she will be faithful unto death. She casts herself off the cliff into the sea. The Dutchman's ship sinks, and in the very last pages of the score, Zenta and the Dutchman rise from the sea, united in death, as the orchestra recalls the redemption motif. Oh, I wish I could see that, you may say. You don't need to see it. You need only close your eyes and listen to the orchestra. They will tell you all your senses need to know. I hope we have been able to convey some of the excitement of this great piece. It follows in a fine tradition of German romantic opera, but it is clear, even at one hearing, that we are in the presence of an artist of great originality. While The Flying Dutchman is a harbinger of later, more profound Musikdramas, to use the term Wagner preferred rather than opera, it is a fascinating and thrilling work, well able to stand on its own merits, and win converts to the complex and often intimidating world of the master, Richard Wagner.